What's going on, everybody? We have the item guide for set 9. We're going to be going over all the champions' items and what items are best on them. And some people approach this using the data method, and data's all fine and dandy until you realize that a lot of it doesn't work, because if you notice at a lot of data sites, the best items are always going to be stuff like Shroud of Stillness, Zephyr, or ZZ Rot Portal, and that's just not true in practice. So what you should do instead is go to bunnymuffins.lol, click this items button up here on the top right, and then go into and see every single champion with their best items. It's not that data is bad or wrong, it's just that data being interpreted by a human being often leads to what I think are the best results. So let's get right into it. Let's start off with all the tier 1 units. We're going to move all the way down into the 2, 3, 4, and 5, and we're just going to pretend that we are going to build our team around these units. This, of course, assumes that we are actually playing around these units, and I wrote some assumptions up here so you could check that out in your free time by going on the website or just by pausing or reading. But let's get right into it. So let's start off with tier 1. I'm going to start off with the tanks on the top left. So if you're ever playing around Poppy, you're generally going to be playing Demacia, and Demacia gives her a Radiant item. So that's why I only have 2 items on her, because the third one should be a Radiant one. But Poppy really likes having resistances because she generates a shield. If we look at all the major tank items, it's going to be like Dragon Claw, Sunfire Cape, Protector's Vow, Redemption, Bramble Vest, Ionic Spark, maybe a Titan's Resolve, Stone Plate, Warmogs, and ZZ Rot Portal. So for Dragon Claw, this one's very situational. It can be the best item or the worst item, so I actually don't put Dragon Claw on any of these champions because it's really just dependent if magic damage comps are in your lobby right now. So you have to scout to figure out when this is good. Sunfire is typically good in teams where fights last a long time. Protector's Vow is really good whenever tanks need to cast really quickly. So you'll notice up here that most of these tier 1 units don't really have that impactful of spells, so I put Protector's Vow on very few of them, if at all. But of course, it's still great for using as an item holder or a generic tank item if you can't build anything super better. Redemption's a really good third tank item, pretty much in all cases. Bramble Vest is only good against critical strike comps. Ionic Spark is only good if your team is magic damage. And then Warmogs and Stone Plate, they're pretty good on almost any tank, so you could build these pretty much whenever. And then ZZ Rot Portal, it's only good on units that you just don't care about. So if we ran a Poppy 2-star in the late game, she'd be a great candidate for ZZ Rot Portal because it gives you a bunch of tank stats, but the unit that it's put on doesn't really matter. So it's kind of like a free tank unit that you don't really have to pay too much attention about. So if you're not investing in your tanks, ZZ Rot's a great item to put on like any of these if they're not 3-star, for example. But moving on into Cho'Gath. Cho'Gath really likes Ionic Spark because you run him with Kai'Sa carry in a lot of cases, and Kai'Sa deals magic damage, so the Ionic Spark's really good. Cho'Gath's got a ton of health if you're playing around him because he'll be stacking up feast stacks into the late game. So Sunfire Cape's pretty good, and then with a lot of health, Redemption is also going to be great. One other thing I want to note is that I tried to make these item recommendations as patch independent as possible. So I believe these items will be great throughout the entire set, just based on how the champions are kind of constructed. But of course, there will be patches where certain champions or items are just completely super strong, and of course you should play around those. Also keep in mind that almost any of the tank items work on all of these tanks, and sometimes we don't get to pick and choose which items we specifically get to put on certain units. But let's say we get an item armory and we get to pick and choose. These are the ones that I would tend to pick. Renekton's great with Stone Plate because the more units that target Renekton, the more he heals. So you just put him out in the front solo tank, everyone surrounds him, and then he does his big spin that heals him for a lot. So I really like Stone Plate on him. You could even build 2 Stone Plates on Renekton, and then Sunfire, Protector's Vow pretty decent because his mana is pretty low. He needs 70 mana to cast his ability, so just getting a Protector's Vow on him allows him to take a bit of damage and heal up without like dying. So he often gets like 2 casts off, sometimes even 3 when he's like that. Next up we have Maokai. Maokai is great in like the Tristana builds where you combine it with Poppy for Yordles for Tristana. So Maokai is definitely going to often be your solo tank or duo tank with Poppy, so Stone Plate is really good. Sunfire Cape pretty good because those fights tend to last a long time, and then Redemption just good generic third tank item. Next up we have is Aurelia. Aurelia isn't really 3-starred that often, but maybe there's going to be a Challenger build later. Maybe there's Challenger reroll with like Samira and Aurelia carry, perhaps down the line. And then Stone Plate is probably going to be the best item on her, and then any 2 generic tank items will be good to finish her off. Next up we have is Viego, and one important note I want to make is that there are multiple ways to build a certain character. There are some RFC Viego builds where you go like 2 RFCs on Viego with like a Rage Blade even, or like a Quicksilver, and those builds can be really powerful in certain situations. Sometimes on certain champions you want to go for crit builds, sometimes you want to go for only attack speed, only attack damage, and that's all going to vary. But you have to make sure that you don't mix and match items too often. For example, I said RFC is really good, but if I built a Viego with double RFC and like a Rage Blade, for example, some people might build 2 RFCs and people might be like, oh, maybe like Bloodthirster's a decent item on this build, but I wouldn't really recommend it on the double Rage Blade build. Instead, I'd go something like maybe even like a triple Rage Blade, or just anything that gets Viego to attack really often, whether it be like a Quicksilver or just some damage item instead. But you don't want to mix and match builds. For example, you don't want to have like double RFC and then add on like a Titan's Resolve, because that would just not really work that well for him, in my opinion. Not that it's bad, it's just not that great, at least compared to the other options that we have. But I think right now, double Titans and a healing item is going to work great on Viego. If you can't get the Bloodthirster, Hand of Justice, or Hextech Gunblade will do fine. But we have not seen that many Viego carries yet, but I think in the future we might. But maybe in those cases you want the RFC build. It depends if his auto attacks or if his ability, which enhances his auto attacks, is kind of prioritized a bit more. Moving on into the backline, we have the AP caster. So I'm going to start off with Orianna. Orianna is pretty much just a support unit, so just build support items on her. That's why I have the chalices over there. Malzahar, gonna be Shojin, Gunblade, and Jeweled Gauntlet, just generic AP damage items with 1 mana regeneration and 1 healing item. Cassiopeia, pretty much the same thing, just a slightly different variation. I think the spell crit on Cassiopeia is not that important because Cassiopeia's first cast wounds the target and then her second cast deals bonus damage. And I feel like on her first cast, even if you crit with a spell crit, you're never gonna kill that unit anyways. But then on the second cast, you generally kill the unit without needing a crit. So that's why I like just pure AP on Cassiopeia instead of having a Jeweled Gauntlet. Then because Cassiopeia has lower mana than Malzahar, blue buff probably going to be a little bit better than Spear of Shojin. Kale's going to be the next one up. Kale really just wants double Rage Blade and then the third item, a Radiant item. That's going to be her best build, but if you can't get double Rage Blade, put like an RFC on her or like maybe a Quicksilver so that she's able to build up Rage Blade stacks. Moving on into the AD carries. Tristana really likes Last Whisper because normally in Tristana builds, there isn't a way to get armor penetration without Last Whisper, so you just really need that on her. Rage Blade, really good for any gunner build because gunners get a lot of free attack damage, so you want to complement it with a bunch of attack speed with the Rage Blade. And then top it off with some sort of big generic damage item amplifier such as Giant Slayer. It could be like a Guard Breaker, it could be like a Runons or something like that. Even like a healing item like Hand of Justice, Hextech Gunblade, any of those will do just fine on her. Samira, Last Whisper is pretty good for her because she could get her opponents to like really low armor levels because Last Whisper does percent armor reduction and then Samira does like a flat reduction as well. So that works out pretty nicely. Deathblade gonna be great for challengers because they get a lot of attack speed from the challenger trait, so getting a lot of attack damage on her does really well. And then lastly, Giant Slayer gives both the stats plus a damage amplifier against tanks. Jhin gonna be a little different. So Deadeyes really like attack damage because you get a free auto attack when you read the Deadeye trait. So we look down here, it's like every 3 seconds Deadeyes attack an enemy with the highest percent health and deal bonus damage. So obviously you just want a lot of attack damage on most of your Deadeyes, and Jhin is a great person for that. IE is really good because his spell really pops off, especially if it hits multiple units. You're always going to overkill your primary target in a lot of cases, but having the crit apply onto the secondary targets ends up being well worth it. Runons is just a really good item whenever you have Deathblade, because the way Runons work is it deals a percent of your attack damage as physical damage, and when you have a lot of attack damage, obviously those things are going to go hand in hand. That's going to be for the 1 cost. Let's move on into the 2 costs. So I make a note down here that some 2-cost units have carry augments. That's going to be Warwick, Swain, Galio, Kassadin, and Set. So when I look at those units, that's going to assume that you have those hero augments and that they're 3-star. Starting off with Kassadin, Jeweled Gauntlet going to be the best item on Kassadin, and then Double-Handed Justice works really well because this gives him 100% critical strike chance. So with Riftwalker, Kassadin's going to be popping a lot of people. There are other builds such as replacing the Hand of Justice with Quicksilver. This also gives him 100% critical strike chance, so those are both really good builds, and Quicksilver allows him to stack up guaranteed at the start of the fight. Both are good. I'm actually not sure which one's better. It's kind of like a tie, but you just really want to focus on having at least 1 Jeweled Gauntlet and 1 Hand of Justice, and then for the last item, either or works just fine. Galio is a little weird. He is a very powerful tank, and typically, since he's an Invoker and a Demacia, the carries for those two traits is either going to be Lux or like a Karma. So you generally want to build an Ionic Spark on him because your team deals a lot of magic damage. So you might as well just get the free magic resist penetration on your Galio on your tank since he's going to live so long. And then Sunfire Cape is going to be good because Invokers kind of like to stack up throughout the fight. And then Protector's Vow is great so that he gets his ability off at the start of the fight also. Next up, let's look at Set. Ionic Spark is really good because he's used in Ionia builds. So again, Karma is going to be a carry, or Kaisa. I know Kaisa is not Ionia, but you often run Kaisa in Ionia builds. So Ionic Spark is going to be great for Set. Set is really good when he's the main focus, so having him solo tank with a stone plate is really nice, and then Protector's Vow is good because he has a crowd control ability. He essentially stuns 2 units, and having him cast earlier in the fight obviously is going to have more impact than when he casts later on. Vi is going to be the last tank in 2 costs, and Vi is good because she reduces the enemy's armor. So again, Protector's Vow going to be great. You notice already, like on the 2 costs, Protector's Vow becomes a little bit more important than the 1 cost because their abilities have more impact. Protector's Vow is also a great like 2nd or 3rd tank item. So if you know you're going to put 2 or 3 items on a unit, it's generally a good item to add on. Which brings me to one of my next points about tank items. Some tank items work great independently, so if you can only throw 1 item on someone, obviously like Thieves' Glove is always going to be the best option because you just get 2 items, so it's the most value. But let's say we're only talking about tank items and you can only throw 1 item on a unit. Either Zizirot Portal or Warmogs are probably going to be your 2 best options because they're just great standalone tank items. However, if you want to complement with like 2 or 3 tank items, I think like Redemption and Protector's Vow scale really well with other items when you go into the late game. But moving back up, Vi, she's going to be used in either Gunner or Deadeye comps, and those comps typically build Rageblade because the carries are going to be Zeri or Aphelios, and because you build Rageblade, that means the fights are going to last a little longer, so Sunfire Cape, slightly more value on her compared to other comps because again, the fights last long, you get a longer time to get the Sunfire buff kind of going. And it's also decent in AoE comps because then if you AoE people with Deadeye, I know Deadeye isn't like a real AoE, but you hit random targets with Deadeye, right? Those units don't heal back up as quickly with the wound effect. But let's move on into the middle units here. I kind of categorize like top left pure tank, middle kind of like the bruisery-ish, melees, the right side the melee carries, bottom right AP carries, bottom like kind of like the weird stuff going on, and then bottom left the AD carries. But Swain, great in a sorcerer comp, so obviously Ionic Spark is going to be the top choice there. Swain's also great as a solo tank because he's got a area of effect ability around him, so I really like the stone plate. And then Titans is just good to kind of stack up on Swain. One thing to note with Swain is that having someone with a Hextech Gunblade on your damage dealer is great because it kind of heals Swain when he's not active in his ultimate. Warwick is really good with his Ravenous Hunter, but you just need him to auto attack a lot. So Quicksilver plus Rageblade, probably going to be the 2 best item combos. 3rd item, having some random healing item is nice. I don't think it's absolutely required, but you could build like all sorts of things on Warwick as the 3rd item. I think like only Quicksilver is like the mandatory item that I would kind of build. Some people like building Titans, but you don't really need it either. Onto the melee carries, we have Zed and Kled. Very similar items. So Zed's a rogue, so that means he has built-in protection. He pretty much has an Edge of Night without needing to build an Edge of Night. So you could go full damage on Zed to really get him to carry. A pattern you may have noticed already is that a lot of melee carries need defensive items to really activate. So Warwick's got the QSS, Kled's got the QSS, Kassadin sometimes uses a QSS. And if we go back to the 1 cost, I talked about the Viego RFC build. Pretty much melee carries need some sort of defense items, but because Zed is a rogue and rogues drop aggro when they reach below a certain health threshold, he pretty much has a built-in defensive item, so you could just go full damage on Zed and go ham with him there. Handed Justice and IE are a great item combo because Handed Justice gives more critical strike chance, and then Titans is just going to be good to get him beefier later on in the game. Kled, you want Quicksilver, Titan's Resolve, and the Bloodthirster. Handed Justice is still really good on Kled, don't get me wrong, but again, since you don't run the crit, I prefer the Bloodthirster because you get the giant shield on Kled. But the Titan's Resolve is of course going to be really necessary because Kled often gets the full stacks very, very easily. Next up, we have in the bottom right, Teemo carry. Teemo carry hasn't really seen the light of day quite yet, but blue buff gonna be great because look at the mana pool, 0 out of 50, so you reduce it to 0 out of 40. Whenever you have low mana pools, blue buff is gonna be a little bit better than Shojin. Jeweled Gauntlet, decent for critting. Multicasters love crit because you're not fully reliant on like getting crits all the time because you cast so often. Pretty much what that means is whenever you have a spellcaster that just does one giant cast, oftentimes Jeweled Gauntlet isn't the best option for them because if you don't crit, you just lose the fight. So you'd rather just have like flat ability power on them. But for units that cast a ton, Jeweled Gauntlet I think is a little bit more consistent. Hextech Gunblade's still pretty good because Hextech Gunblade is generally good on backline damage dealers. Pretty much for healing, Bloodthirster is more for frontline, Gunblade more for backline, and then Handed Justice is kind of like the in-between item that you just build to put on either. Talia gonna do a very similar build to Teemo, just switching up the mana items and the damage item a little bit, but honestly, it really doesn't matter that much. Hat versus Jeweled Gauntlet pretty much is around the same, as long as the game is balanced. Soraka is going to be a support. You could put a Spear of Shojin on Soraka if you just want someone who heals your team a ton, but I think just having the Chalices on her as a support unit is going to be great. Same thing with Ashe. Just build the Zeke's Heralds on Ashe. Ashe is not going to be carrying your team if you give her like triple Deathblade, for example. I'm not saying it's going to be like super horrible, but she's mainly just a support unit, which is perfectly fine. There's got to be some support units in the game. Jinx is going to be great with Runons. I like Rageblade for gunners, and then IE is great for her ability because she's more of like, she does like a ton of damage whenever you get her cast off. So that's kind of why I like the IE on her a little more. A lot of people ask me questions on like, when do I build Deathblade versus Infinity Edge? And Infinity Edge is definitely better on units that deal more damage from their ability. And then Deathblade is going to do a lot better on units that deal more damage with their auto attacks. That's generally the rule of thumb that you should be using. Now, I didn't really realize this until I made this item guide because I had no idea that Taric was the only true tank at 3 cost, which is completely opposite to previous sets. In previous sets, there are a ton of tank options at 3 cost, but I noticed when I was making this guide, I was like, holy cow, no wonder why the game felt so weird. I just couldn't explain it. But the reason is that Taric is just the only tank unit at 3 cost, which is crazy. All these other melee units at 3 costs are all damage units, but tank items for Taric, Redemption is probably the best item on Taric. I feel like he's one of the only units that could use like a solo redemption because Taric is often going to be in between all of your other units because you want him to give his shield to adjacent allies. So it would make sense that you build a redemption on him. But let's say you want to go like full Taric tank, probably Ionic Spark going to be great because he's a sorcerer, so you're pretty much always going to be running magic damage. And then Sunfire Cape, this could honestly be anything. It could be like the Protector's Vow, it could be like a Warmogs, almost anything will do over there. But moving on into the next units, we have Garen. A lot of melee carries here. Bloodthirster plus Rageblade going to be the best item combination on Garen. Rageblade's good because his ability is built off of his attack speed. Pretty much his spin lasts longer the more attack speed you have, so Rageblade's just a must on him. And then Bloodthirster, just good generic item. And then since he's a Demacia, not having the third item works really well on him, because then you get the Radiant Demacia item. Darius going to be the next choice. IE Titans Bloodthirster going to be great on him. Notice here, like a lot of the melee carries do not have a defensive item. They have a healing item, but they don't have a defensive item. And that's just because Garen is a very specific case. If you would build a third item on Garen, like QSS could be an option. But for stuff like Darius, he really just needs full damage to pop off. And when he's casting, I believe he doesn't really get interrupted that much. So once he gets going, he keeps dealing his damage. And then that way you're not like super reliant on having some sort of defensive item. Another thing I want to note is, remember how we said right before we got into 3 cost units, IE great for spellcasters, Deathblade better for like auto attackers? Well, Darius has got the Infinity Edge and then Akshan has a Deathblade. So that's kind of like the difference that they kind of have there. Rek'Sai going to be the next one up. You pretty much just want like double Titans plus Bloodthirster, or just like Titans Bloodthirster plus any third item. You often play Rek'Sai with either Bruisers or Void. And typically in Bruiser builds, you're able to get Rek'Sai at full Titan stacks pretty much all the time, because if you're running 6 Bruiser, Rek'Sai is going to be huge, especially at 3-star. So again, that's why you don't really need the defensive item on Rek'Sai, because you already have built-in defense from your traits in the Bruiser trait. Katarina and Echo are both rogues, so again, no defensive item needed, even though they're in the front of the battle. But Katarina having Ionic Spark, really nice to have, but you don't really need this. I think more important is probably like the Handed Justice or Jeweled Gauntlet. Having some sort of healing on Katarina is really important because she doesn't have any healing built into her kit or from her traits, so that's going to be really nice. And then since she gets a lot of ability power from Noxus, you don't really need to build a hat on her. Jeweled Gauntlet's going to give you slightly more value. Moving on to Echo, you just need to crit every time you play Echo, so Jeweled Gauntlet, Double-Handed Justice is going to be the way to get 100% crit and give Echo a bunch of healing. But Echo's kind of fallen out of favor at the time of recording, but I believe once he gets back, this is going to be the build if he ever is going to be your primary carry. Next up, we have Sona. Sona's a support unit. Chalice her up, maybe give her a hat. She did deal a lot of damage at the start of the set, but then they nerfed her because they're like, hey, she's a support unit. Why is she out damaging pure damage units? So I think other than like a Chalice or like at maximum, maybe like a Spear of Shojin, there isn't that much use for Sona for like super itemizing as your carry. Vel'Koz is pretty decent, but the thing about Vel'Koz is that he often gets outshined by other carries because in the Void trait, Kai'Sa is a better carry, and then in the Sorcerer trait, Lux is typically a better carry. But if I had to build him, I'd build Spear of Shojin plus a healing item plus any damage item. It might be Jeweled Gauntlet, it might be Guard Breaker, it might be Giant Slayer, it might be Archangels, it might be Hat. Pretty much anything will do on Vel'Koz. So the third item I think doesn't really matter. I think it's more important to just have one mana item and one healing item. And since he's 60 mana, Spear of Shojin's really good because it's just 4 autos to get your cast off. Blue buff takes 5 mana. So I think there are certain breakpoints where Spear of Shojin just outshines the blue buff. And this is one of those cases. Next up, we have Karma. Karma is generally going to get a lot of mana from the Invoker trait. So what I like to do with Karma is just put 3 items on her that do not give her mana. I'm not saying mana is bad. You could definitely put a blue buff or a Spear of Shojin on your Karma, and she'll pop off really nicely with that. But if you're going the Invoker build, having like 1 healing item plus 2 damage items I think are going to be the best thing to do. If you're going Ionia, that's generally when I put a mana item on my Karma. But both builds works, it just depends on what traits you're kind of playing around when you're running carry Karma. Callista is a little easier. It's just Rageblade Static Shiv every time, and then third item, I think Giant Slayer is the best, but it really doesn't matter what her third item is. She just attacks so quickly, so she's just the best Static Shiv holder in the game, and then just have her attack as often as possible because she's an on-hit champion. So if you're an on-hit champion, you need Rageblade, so itemization for Callista is super, super easy. Lissandra going to be the next unit. She's more of a support, so I like having the Chalice of Power plus the Morello, but Chalice of Power is extremely powerful on Lissandra because if you ever get 2 Chalice of Powers on her, she just casts right away at the start of the fight. So she'll just apply the Morello right away. I should honestly just put the third one on her. And she gives you a buff for your team, so the units that she hits take 10% more damage, and if that happens at the start of the fight, obviously you get a bigger benefit from it. So having double Chalice, which gives 45 mana each, very, very good on this champion. Next up, we have Jace, just another support champion. He gives attack speed to the people next to him, so Zeke's Herald is going to be like the only item you'll ever need on Jace, so put 3 of them on him if you want. Akshan's going to be the AD carry of the 3-cost units. Akshan is a Deadeye, so I really like Deathblade a lot, and then complement Deathblade with the Runon's Hurricane, really nice to do. Third item, it could honestly like be another Deathblade, be another Runon's, but Infinity Edge is pretty decent because his spell still does like quite a bit, but it could also be stuff like Giant Slayer, Rageblade, Guard Breaker, Handed Justice, Hextech Gunblade. Any of those will work just fine on Akshan, but I think the most important are going to be Deathblade and Runon's. Let's move on into the 4-costs. 4-cost is probably the most important thing to know because 4-cost units are going to be the bread and butters of most comps, especially if you do like standard leveling, like fast 7, fast 8 strategies. These are going to be like the main dudes that you kind of play. But the main tanks of this set are going to be Shen and Sejuani. These two are just like the 2 tankiest units you can get right now, mixed with like some support from your team, but they are like pure tank units. Their abilities don't stun. Normally in 4-cost tanks, you get a lot of CC from them, but this set we don't really have that. So Shen, you just want him to live as long as possible. So you just put any 3 tank items on Shen. It really depends on your team. If you're running multiple tanks, obviously don't build the stone plate if you can help it, but it's not the end of the world if you have it. But always tailor your items to the people in your game. For example, if there's a lot of magic damage, build the Dragon Claw. If everyone's building Jeweled Gauntlet and Infinity Edge, build the Bramble Vest. If you're running Karma carry in Ionia, definitely like build the Ionic Spark on him if you don't have a Static Shiv. Always adapt your build to whatever's happening in your game. So obviously, like, you could look at these pictures and memorize them and like use them in most of your games, you'll be fine. But if you want to get that like extra ounce of like optimization, definitely have to look at what's happening in your game and making some decisions off of that. Sejuani, just generic tank items will do again. Redemption, Warmog's, Protector's Vow, they all scale pretty well together because they all build off of like max health, so it's a pretty decent combo. But resistances on her is also pretty good. You could just slam a stone plate on her if she's like your only tank. The thing about Sejuani is if you're running like 6 bruiser or 4 bruiser, you have a lot of melee units, so I don't really like stone plate on her if I'm running a lot of bruisers. But if she's kind of your only tank, if you're running like Sejuani plus a Scion and only running 2 bruiser, those are the cases where I'd prefer a stone plate a lot more. Jarvan's very interesting. So Jarvan is really just there to CC the enemy team, and he just blows everyone up. Having 1 Protector's Vow on him is already really good because he casts pretty early into the fight. But if you ever get 2 Protector's Vow on Jarvan, he just casts right at the start of the fight. So you know how a lot of people clump up on the bottom left or bottom right? You could just move him right in front of their team. So for example, if everyone has like all their units on the right side, you just put him over here, he'll start the fight, CC 8 units, and you pretty much just win the fight after that if your team isn't like complete garbage. And he could also do that as a 1-star Jarvan because he just casts right away. Doesn't really matter what you do. Obviously, stun duration gets longer if you level him up, but it's a very powerful unit. And then I found that Jarvan doesn't really get his second cast off that often. Even when I put like 3 items on my Jarvan, sometimes he still doesn't go off. So I focus more on the first cast of Jarvan than the subsequent cast. I don't like try to greed and like put like tons of items on Jarvan in order to get him to really pop off, because in the games where Jarvan can cast twice, you probably won those fights already. So I'd rather itemize other people, just make sure his first cast goes really well, and then hopefully you end the fight at that point. Next up we have Nasus. Nasus is kind of a funny unit. He can do like a bruiser-ish build with like Bloodthirster and Titans, or he could do a full tank build. So if you put any 3 tank items on Nasus, that's going to work out perfectly well for your team. But he could also use the bruiser build. So I don't really have like a set recommendation on Nasus. Just go all in on one certain build. Don't kind of like have your feet in both sides of the edge or whatever it's called and build all sorts of weird stuff on him. Don't like build him damage and tank at the same time is what I'm trying to say. Just like either go full bruiser or go full tank, one of the two. Yasuo is very interesting. So Yasuo is extremely good in the mid game and like the early late game. But I feel like in the super late game, he falls off a bit. That's why I only really like investing 2 items on my Yasuo, not so much 3. I'd rather have the 3rd item on someone else. Unless of course you play maybe like Ezreal or Ornn who give you a ton of items, then you have enough items to put 3 items on Yasuo. But in most games, I'd really just like having 2 items on Yasuo. And I think the most important item is going to be Edge of Night. Edge of Night just allows your Yasuo to cast a bunch more, so it just works out really well. After that, Yasuo does have built-in healing. It's only 15%, it's not that much, but some people like putting Bloodthirster on Yasuo. It's really good. You could just build it on him if you want, but the item that I really like on Yasuo is Deathblade. Deathblade works really well because he scales so much off of his attack damage. So what item gives the most attack damage? It's going to be Deathblade. So Deathblade I think is just the best damage item on Yasuo by far, like it's not even close. So I think these are the 2 items I would put on him. Some people like putting RFC on Yasuo. There are ways to aim your RFC so that it always hits the enemy backline. And that build has some interesting things to do as well. I'm not sure if it's actually like the best thing ever, because would I rather have an Edge of Night? Probably, because he's going to work his way slowly to the backline anyways. But obviously like RFC is still going to be very powerful. Because if you're guaranteed to CC a backline enemy carry, it's going to be decent as long as you can position for it every game. Stuff like Titans also works, Hand of Justice, BT, like a lot of people say like, oh, the overhealing's bad, but I don't really think it's that bad because again, like 15% healing on a melee unit isn't that much. Gwen is the next unit we're going to go over, and Gwen is one of those cases where she actually likes healing a lot. I've checked the data a ton, and pretty much all the healing items are great on Gwen, but there are a lot of different ways to build Gwen. Some team comps where you play Gwen, you want to end the fights as fast as possible, in which case you kind of just go full damage on her. Build stuff like Ionic Spark, you put a hat on her, you maybe put like a jeweled gauntlet on her, and you just use her to try to like just kill things as fast as possible. However, if she's like your secondary carry, I prefer having the build up here where she's like pretty tanky, and still does like a decent amount of damage. So I think Hand of Justice is really good for that. I think Titan's Resolve is pretty decent for that. Bloodthirster gonna be good, or like anything that gives her more survivability, because in those games, you don't need Gwen to really like pop off and kill everything. You just need her to buy time for the rest of your team. Similar to Urgot. Sometimes in Urgot comps where you're playing Zon, like you're playing like Zeri plus Urgot, or you're doing Deadeye with Aphelios plus Urgot, your main carry is Zeri or Aphelios. So you just need your Urgot to kind of just like disrupt the enemy team and just do like a little damage here and there while tanking a bit. So their items are kind of going to be a little bit similar, like Gwen and Urgot's. Obviously, one of them is attack damage based, one of them's ability power based, but they kind of fill the same role, just like on opposite ends. Next up, we have Azir. Azir, I think his best item is Rageblade by far. Like, you can play Azir without Rageblade for sure, but I think it's just so good. And whenever you have a Rageblade on an ability power champion, pairing it up with a Static Shiv is like very, very good too. But you don't need the Static Shiv. You could just go like full damage on Azir. You could do like Rageblade, RFC even, so that he doesn't have to move, Rageblade, Jeweled Gauntlet, Giant Slayer, Guard Breaker, Archangel Staff. All these items are gonna work out just great. But I think what I like is having like a tiny bit of healing on him. He gets some healing from Shurima. Shurima does heal your units a bit, but I feel like it's not enough. But any team that scales up into the later parts of the fight, especially with a Rageblade or like an Archangels, I feel like having healing gives it a little bit more value. But yeah, Static Shiv, if you don't have any other form of magic shred, is really good. Again, with the Rageblade combo, you just attack so quickly. So I think like these two items plus any third item is going to be great on Azir. Lux, I really like Gunblade on her a lot because she does so much damage. So you just get like a ton of healing from it. And then blue buff just allows her to cast right away, and like she has like a relatively low mana pool, so she could cast pretty often right after that. So either blue buff or Shojin plus Gunblade probably going to be the preferred build for Lux. And then after that, you don't need the third item because you're going to get a Radiant item on Lux. But she works with pretty much anything. I kind of like how she's designed this set because whenever I put any two random damage items on Lux, it tends to work out. I don't need like perfect items every time. Kai'Sa's a little weird. So they just changed Kai'Sa where they increased her mana pool by a ton. So I think having a Spear of Shojin is incredibly powerful on her because it allows her to cast like that much more often. And typically I do like putting the Static Shiv on Kai'Sa, but since she's a challenger unit, I'm often playing Kalista, and Kalista's holding my Static Shiv instead. So I don't actually like building Static Shiv on my Kai'Sa if I'm running Kalista, and I'd prefer just having 3 pure damage items on my Kai'Sa instead. Guardbreaker, I think, is probably her best item because she's attacking tanks often, and she does her little AoE thing. So you could get Guardbreaker bonus damage on like backline units with Kai'Sa, and that's just like such a powerful effect, right? So I think that's really strong on her too. And then Kai'Sa generally likes long fights, so stuff like Rageblade, stuff like Archangel Staff are both really good. Notice if you do build the Rageblade, you definitely do want to put the Static Shiv on Kai'Sa as well, just because those two items kind of go hand in hand. But she could use other stuff too. Jeweled Gauntlet, good. Hand of Justice, good. Hextech Gunblade, good. Healing's pretty decent on Kai'Sa as well. Or you could get it from one of your augments. Next up, we have Urgot. Urgot's kind of like the in-between of like semi-range versus like pure AD carry type of thing. So he pretty much just jumps into the enemy team and kind of suicides. So with that in mind, I do like having healing on Urgot. So if you run the Infinity Edge, and I really like Infinity Edge on Urgot because his spell does like a considerable amount of damage, I like combining it with the Hand of Justice to give him more critical strike chance. But if you don't have the IE, just put Bloodthirster. Bloodthirster's going to be better than Hand of Justice in those cases. And then Titan's Resolve, since he's going to be in the middle of the fight, he's hopefully going to be able to stack it to full and then heal up and sustain throughout a lot of parts of the fight. Urgot, similar to Yasuo, I think is better in the mid to late game rather than like the pure late game. Aphelios, Rageblade gonna be really good for him because he just likes to stack up and go infinite because the fights go really long whenever you play Aphelios. Deathblade gonna be really good for any Deadeye because of the way Deadeye trait works. You just get a free auto attack on someone at every 3 seconds. And then Giant Slayer is just pretty good generic damage item. You could also use like Runons, Hand of Justice, Hextech Gunblade, Infinity Edge. All those are gonna be fine. Last up, we have Zeri. Zeri really likes Last Whisper. So Aphelios doesn't need Last Whisper because you're often running him with Freljord. You can still build Last Whisper on Aphelios. It's still pretty good because the Freljord buff does not last the whole fight. But Zeri for sure absolutely needs the Last Whisper because typically you don't get armor penetration from other sources. so you just need to build it on her. Rageblade, really good on any gunner build because gunners, they gain attack damage every time they attack up to 8 stacks, so you just want her to attack as much as possible. And since she gets attack damage from her trait, you just want to complement her with attack speed and the armor penetration, and then the damage amplification with the Giant Slayer. Another decent item on Zeri is going to be the Quicksilver, just so that she doesn't get interrupted while she's stacking her Rageblade. I think Quicksilver is pretty underrated on a lot of gunners because, again, gunners just need to get their stacks off, and Quicksilver is an item that really allows them to get that really easily. Let's move on into the legendary units, which are the 5 costs. Now we can have fun in the game. So legendaries are pretty fun, right? They're some of the best units in their unit slots, but I found that in this set, there's some of the best units in their role slots. For example, like Scion is by far the best tank. I think Senna's like probably the best support unit. And then Aatrox, probably the best bruiser, you know, but like it has to be because they're legendaries, right? But I found that a lot of the 5 costs this set are actually just utility units. So like Ryze is pure utility. Heimerdinger's sucks as a champion. You just want to have him stun and then like itemize the Apex turret, right? Ahri's decent, but if you need to kind of build around her and have her 2-star. And then Bel'Veth, like just kind of decent on her own, nothing really insane. But I feel like this set, legendaries are definitely more utility focused. But let's start off with Scion. I think he's definitely like the best tank in the game. Just make him as tanky as possible. Any 3 tank items will do. A lot of people think like, oh, you want to build attack damage on him based on the way his ability works and his respawning works. But because of the way he respawns, I think tank items definitely outweigh the damage items. So just build full tank on Scion. I'm pretty sure building him AD is like a noob trap. Cassante, very powerful unit. So you could go blue buff to Cassante if you want. If you only could build 1 item on Cassante, I'd probably just build the blue buff and that's it. But if you're doing triple item on him, I think like having him be full tank is very powerful. Definitely want the Protector's Vow plus Redemption combo. This gives him 60 mana, so how much mana does he have? He has 0 out of 60. So when you have these 2 items on Cassante, he just ults at the start of the fight and knocks their main tank away from your damage carries. So let's say you got like your main carries on the bottom left and their main tank is right in front of Cassante. They're not going to bother killing that unit because Cassante blew them away. So then your units can just kill their off tanks really quickly and then move on to their backline. So this item combo, probably like one of the best item combos on Cassante. And then third item, just Warmogs because it complements Redemption and Protector's Vow really well because both of these scale off of max health. But honestly, any 3 tank item Cassante I've never been disappointed in. And if I'm only putting like 1 or 2 items on him, blue buff plus any other item gonna work just fine. Aatrox is gonna be really interesting. I think Edge and Knight is the best item on Aatrox because it just gives him so many different lives. But you pretty much just build damage items on Aatrox. A lot of people like building like the bruiserish items on him, and those are definitely fine, but I think going pure damage plus maybe like a Bloodthirster because he doesn't always have his heal up is going to be a decent build on him. And obviously he loves stats like attack speed and attack damage because it all gets converted into attack damage. But honestly, the best way to use Aatrox is to put a lot of emblems on him. Pretty much any emblem. Some of the best users are going to be either Aatrox or Bel'Veth. So that's one thing to keep in mind whenever you're playing these 2 champions. Bel'Veth going to be great with an RFC just so she gets more range on her lash out ability, because you lose a lot of value when she kills someone but no one else is near her, so then she just whacks the air and just like she's literally just punching the air and doing nothing. So RFC great on her. You do not want like double RFC. So with Viego, double RFC I think is actually pretty interesting, but with Bel'Veth, I really don't think you need double or triple RFC because with the 1 RFC, she gets like 3 range, and that's more than enough when she like jumps into the center of the fight to kind of hit everyone anyway, so you don't need the 4th one because the bonus range is kind of wasted. I like having Quicksilver on her so she doesn't get interrupted at the start of the fight, especially since she's in the front. And then Bloodthirster, just good generic healing item to get her to like not die and cast multiple times per fight. Ahri, gonna be very good with blue buff. Blue buff is by far her best item, and with Ionia especially, she gets her triple cast like pretty quickly because she gets bonus mana from the Ionia trait. And then after that, just pair it with like any 2 regular mage items. I kind of like Hat over the Jeweled Gauntlet because again, she has that 1 big spell cast. And let's say you're really relying on a Jeweled Gauntlet crit and it doesn't happen, you just lose a fight in those cases. So I think just giving her a Hat might be the best thing to do. Honestly, maybe blue buff, double Hat might be better than the Gunblade. It depends on what the rest of your team is, but if she's like solo carrying, you probably want something like this. But if it's duo carry or you have decent tanks, then Hextech Gunblade could be good. Maybe she does her big cast twice in a fight. Heimerdinger, just put the Spear of Shojin on him. Heimerdinger doesn't actually like do that much damage. He just stuns people. So he's put on Shojin duty and just like stun bot for the whole game. Apex turret's pretty interesting. So there are a lot of different combos you can do. So if it's super early in the game and assuming the game is balanced, Goldenator should be good, but that assumes the game's balanced. Some patches it's not, and that means the Goldenator not going to get much value compared to the other stuff. But the earlier in the game you get it, the better it is, obviously, because then you get more gold, which could hopefully improve your team a lot. And we all know gold is worth more earlier in the game than later. So the triple Mechanoswarm is obviously really good, but you can mix it with Shrink Ray. Shrink Ray is really good if you need the effect, so obviously always tailor Heimerdinger's upgrades to your team. I don't really know how else to say that. You need to tailor everything to your team. All these items that we've been talking about, like tailor it to your team. There's really like no excuse. But if you need the Magic Shred or Armor Shred, definitely do Shrink mode instead of the Mechanoswarm thing. Like just, you could even do triple Shrink, but like probably having like double Shrink, one Swarm thing would probably be pretty decent. And then if you don't have any tanks on your team, let's say you're running only one tank, having triple Repair, also really powerful. But if you do the repair route, I would pretty much only triple repair. I wouldn't really use any of the other upgrades. Maybe you could double plus like a Shrink or something and just use it as a utility unit as well. But I think the triple repair route is going to be much better than like double repair plus something else. But Apex turret is pretty decent, so pretty cool to experiment with the different choices you have and just build it around your team. Rise is a little complicated because he has like 10 different versions of him. I don't even know how many there are. Read his thing. If he is a utility unit on that map, build Spear Shojin or Blue Buff just to get him to cast a lot. There are some maps where Rise is a damage dealer, and in those cases you build damage items on him like Jeweled Gauntlet, Hat, Giant Slayer, Archangels, things like that. But in 99% of cases, not 99, but like most of his realms are gonna be utility based. So in general, like if you're thinking of Rise items like Spear Shojin or like Blue Buff, gonna be great on him just to get him to cast a lot. Obviously, the choice between these two items is gonna depend on his mana pool. If he's got a lot of mana, Spear Shojin's gonna be better. If he's got a little mana, Blue Buff gonna be a bit better. So always keep that in mind whenever you're playing Rise. You have to tailor it to whatever his ability is. If it looks like it does a lot of damage, build damage. If it looks like it's a lot of utility, build mana. So last up is Senna. I've called Senna the best support champion in the game because her shield is just so big. And I don't know, like you play her naked, like you don't even need traits with her, and I feel like she just always pops off. And she buffs your team up like, holy cow. It's really insane. Obviously works better if you actually use the attack speed, but there are a lot of attack speed based carries in the game in this set, so you pretty much always get value from it. But I feel like Spear Shojin plus Rageblade just gets her to cast a lot, so I think that's going to be the best item combo on Senna. Don't really need to put 3 items on her because like she doesn't do like that much damage, so I'd rather have the 3rd item on someone else. But I guess if you have to, like, just get her to cast more. Maybe like 2nd Shojin or something like that, or maybe like RFC, or maybe like a QSS so she doesn't get interrupted. Probably those will do fine. If you want to do damage, maybe like a Runons would probably be not bad. But there are a ton of ways to build all the champions in TFT. All this will be on the website, so definitely reference that if you ever want to see like, oh, like I forgot what to build on this person. What do I do? The website's a generally good guide for that. And you may notice that a lot of these builds might be different than what's shown on the tier list because the tier list has a lot more information in it and it has a lot of more situational things taken into account. But if you're ever wondering like, oh, should I listen to this or that? Probably the tier list is going to be a little more accurate for very specific purposes, but for general guidelines, the item guide is going to be best for you. And it's nice to have just to kind of teach yourself how every champion kind of works and what items work and don't work on certain champions. But again, all this will be on the website, bunnymuffins.lol/items, just for you to reference whenever you want. And obviously there's a lot of other goodies on the site, so definitely check those out when you have time. But that's going to be it for me for items. The tip of the day is going to be always tailor items to whatever your team needs because that's going to be the most important thing to do every single time. But that's going to be it for me today. I'll see you all next time.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to share and subscribe, and of course smash that like button. Each like is an LP I gain before the next video.